بروجرامنا حزنا لكم مسينا لنا سايبر باور اوف تግራይ لو معنتي استفلاليو اقدستيكم نغرات اتكيرنا بنقللنا مساعاتكم هذا توم ناي اب تግራይ ዝግበር ዘሎ بالجزيره استجبر ناي humanitarian situation report خنقربلكم هنا كلاي اني موناليزا ناي موناليزا كنتات بتعم زحزن زقرب خنقربلكم هنا كلاي لما تعسوب سراويت اب ناي فيديو ملكتات مصيومن الله زوم ناي فيديو ايفيدنسات ويم دما مرغاغصي عسوب غزو ارمني هونه سراو شعبيه اكابي شرا نحلفو زري
لفوت مسواتي حلفوت خرف رفوت عين هرف رفوت مليون سعسلي كوف فكر لبا كميلكي حديدكي عدي يسلا الهزبا قسانتنا خوينو دحرق قسانتكي دحرق قسانتكي نصدي خاصو نبل كم زان السلكي كم زان السلكي ولد مخان عدا تግራይ ولاديتي كملكي حديدكي زعبا حلم ليتي يترفنا وحوان نصومون غنى الراس السنالكي ولد قدي خوينا هلا وقستتكي يا بحلمي كعرفو يداوي الزرقح حسابا وحقفو حسابا وحقفو وقح كتب المدري بسيرات صحاي كمي حديرة بالأحاد الكيرها كمي حديرة عداي هرفانا في غلباي كمي حديرة عداي هرفانا في غلباي عقليها بالنمر متان كتسممو تنافقني تنو تግራይ يدعمو تنافقني تنو زعد يدعمو هنا كابسكي بدوه كملكي حديركي نبلكي نقو صبوك منا كريعك هنتو أهرف أمنا أهرف أمنا وقح كتب المدري بسرات صحاي كمي حديرة بالأحاد الكيدها بالنمبر متانك تسممو تنافقي تنو تግራይ يدعمو تنافقي تنو زعد يدعمو صلالي انديامو كبرتي انديامو ينديامو صلالي ينديامو حبني ينديامو
شمو ذا فيديو زيا حز زريكم بطعم زقرمي انتي سراويت إرترا طاليلو ناب تግራይ درجاتي زلو مالتي قال سماي غزاوتنا كله مالتيو جن عالم منستات كبز قرمكم اتوان خالي ندول يوم زارو زلو ذا فيديو زي حريكم زي حيلتات وررتي إثيوبيان إرتران أبشرن داسلاسي بورح دار حزم علتيو سرقوا حزام تعرفوا نطرنات تدخلون زفروسون ساعات كابوتن هذا مسلي ناي تግራይ عندنا أيو نزين هالو أيو أبي أحمد تراوان ناتوني قالين ناتو صحيح تريو لهم تانكتات كي ترفع يعني بتግራይ بشرا ختماتات حليفا دخدا كهدتن صلمتن زرع زلو حزب تግራይ سي ኢትዮጵያዊት ያልካ ንኽትዛረቡን ብጣዕሚ ክነዋፀሎም ኣለና እርዳታ ክንገብር ኣለና ብዙ ብናይ ኤርትራ ወታደራት عدنا تግራይ አውሪሮምዋ ሩኡይ ዝኾነ ቪዲዮታት እንዳሃለወ ንትግራይ ግን ክነዋፀሎም ኣለና ንህዝብና ማዓቱ ቆይ every day ከም መናእስያት ዝርሽኑ ዝውዕሉ ዘለዉ ዞም ሰዓት እዚኣቶም every day በቃ ታንክታቶም ጋዕገልጠሞም ኣይተርፍ ኩሉ ነገሮም ሒዞም እዮም ዝኸዱ ዘለዉ ካብ ዝገርሞ እዚ ኩለይ ግን ከምቲ ዝሪእዎ ተለኹም ነው بطعم زحزن ترى والله الناي قدم ترين تاونو ينترز بحالا طعم زقرن نزي እንግዲህ የትግራይን ህዝብ እንደግፋለን የትግራይን ህዝብ ኢንፍራስትራክቸር ወይም ደግሞ ልማት መልሶ እንዲቋቋም እናደርጋለን ዝውሉ ዘለው ብዙም አራዊት ሰራዊት شعبية تعدي أوريرهم وعند هاللو يوم كم زيزولنا زلوا رأسنا وقيام شافليهم أجرنا يوم سفر أجرنا أزمالته أنا يدليله حزون عبر اسموتنا حزون عبر اسي تግራይ كم زيل عند هاللوت جنزب كأراريو بشمنا جنزب كأراريو يدليله مالتي كم تريو زلهم أنت زعزو هنا نوحتي مخاين قبل الإعلان تصعينهم بقطع ما شري يحلفوا له بقصوينا زغرني زحزن عم زحزن نجار مالتي هو بتري والله مثلا طعمك أبزي أكتمانا كلها تختم هذا معني يوما ترى والله أراويت سراويت إرترا مس جريكان زعز مسد قصاو يعني بس 3 عامات إرترا هاد مسمرها أتو هلو تحيزم زحازو جريكان استخدموا وخدان زغورو ጫማ ምንም ለውጥ ዘይብሎም عدم كلوط زي خولو استلوط عد بقناعتن بحسادن كعنوا ما تيمون له هقدف زي زقبر زلو مثلا زوعل زلو سب حدري مسانا صبو ينقصاص له نظام سب حدري زياتهم مسانا تنقصايسهم منم كلوط السبع يكونان سياس مالت all he knows is مقتال محراد استسرحوا انفراستراكشرات مقصال تزي كوينو منو عينت لوط خمس زخل حيلي لمعات كحسب زخل حيلي يكون نسي تايدا سراويت ندعتكا لا سلطنكا ፅላኣት ምዝራእ ዓይነት ከምዚ ዓይነት ራ ዝነበሩ መንእሰያት ወዲኡ ቀቲሉ ወዲኡ ገሊኦም ብሓራእትዮም ገሊኦም ንሊብያ ተሰይዶም ገሊኦም ትግራይ መፅኦም ነይሮም ሕዚ ኣብ ትግራይ ዘሎ ሰላም እውን ኣቕኒእዎ ኣብ ትግራይ ዘሎ መንእሰያት ክቐትል ጀሚሩ ኣሎ እዚ መቕታል ዘይፀግብ ሸይጣን ሰራዊት ዘይመቕታል ዝቐትል መሳርያ ንምስራሕ ይኸቢድ እምበር ቃታ ስሒብካ ሰብ መቕታል ቀሊል ይብጣዕሚ እታ ዝቐለለት ማንም ፀማም ደደብ ክገብራ ዝኽእል ነገር እንተሃለወት እንታያ ናይ ካላሽን ቃታ ስሒብካ ሰብ መቕታል ንሰብ ክትሐዊ ንሰብ ክትድሕን ካላሽን ክትሰርሕ ሽጉጥ ክትሰርሕ ግን ትዝኸበደ ፍልጠትን ትምህርትን ፅንዓትን ዘልዮ እዩ እዚ ኣይፈልጥን እዩ ሰብ ምድሓነ ይፈልጥ ካላሽን ምስራሕ ይፈልጥ ዝዝማረኾ ካላሽን ወይም ድማ ዝገዝኦ ካላሽን እንዳምፃኻ ሰብ መቕታል ጥራሕ ከመይ ጌርካ ሰብ ሃንድል ከም ትገብር ከመይ ጌርካ ሆስፒታል ከመይ ጌርካ ህዝቢ ናይ ሰብ ኑሮ ከመይ ጌርካ ከተማሓሽ ከም ትኽእል እዚ ኣይተወለደሉን ኣይተፈጠረሉን ናይ ናቱ ብጣዕሚ ዘገርም ነገር እንዳረገፁ ኣሎ ዝበሃል ሆቴላት ብታንኪ ገሊኡ ብታንኪ ኸይዶምሉ ገሊኡ ብመዳፍዕ ብሞርተር ይወቅዕዎ ኣለዉ እዚ ግን I don't know صح ዘይወግሕ መሲሎም ከይኸውን I don't know ኣብዛእትዋ ኣትዋ ሻዕብያ እንትኾነ ህዝቢ ትግራይ ክውድኦም ነቲ ምስኪን ህዝቢ ኤርትራ እዩ ምንም ዘይገብሮ እምበር ነቲ ኣብ ሻዕብያ ኢዱ ዝሓውስ ዘሎ ኣብዚ ርኩስ ህዝብታት ዝቐትል ዘሎ ካላሽን ሒዙ ይኹን መኪና እንዳዘወረ ይኹን እንዳጣቕ ህዝቢ ትግራይ ኣብዛእትዋ ኣትዩ ህዝቢ ትግራይ ድሓን ብጣዕሚ ዝገርም በቃ ብታንክታት ብገለመልኦም በቃ ክስታይ ዝገብሮ ዘሎ ሕዚ ቀፂለ ክስታይ ክረአየኩም እየ እዛ ናይ ኣልጀዚራ ሪፖርት ኣላ ኣብዚኣ ክረአየኩም እየ
Almost 2.5 years after the murder of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi, press freedom advocates try to do what the Biden administration has chosen not to, bring the Crown Prince to justice. In a world plagued with information overload, old-school newsletters delivered via email may be the antidote we need. And so you think you're funny.
I think he's trying to make a joke.
Oh, it's okay.
But can you be funny on Zoom? We begin in Ethiopia, where journalists have finally made it back into a region they had been locked out of for months, Tigray. Fighting broke out there in November between federal forces sent in by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's administration and soldiers on the side of the regional government, led by the Tigray People's Liberation Front, the TPLF. Complicating the picture are troops from neighboring Eritrea, also at war with the TPLF. With journalists on the outside looking in, news had been trickling out of Tigray, stories told by refugees, disturbing ones of human rights abuses, war crimes, signs of an ethnic cleansing offensive. About 10 days ago, a handful of international news organizations, including this one, were finally allowed to return to Tigray. Now that they're back reporting on an ultra-sensitive story, the authorities in Addis Ababa have been taking issue with the coverage. Our starting point this week is a city that the world really hasn't seen since November, the Tigrayan capital, Mekelle.
There is a normalcy in the images coming out of Tigray that is deceptive. People going about their business in Mekelle, while just outside the city, stories trickle out of what the United Nations calls possible crimes against humanity. For months, journalists were locked out of the conflict zone by Ethiopian authorities determined to control the coverage. Al Jazeera was one of 7 news organizations finally allowed back into Tigray last week. Its cameras were met by people who, after having their internet shut down, their communications cut off, were driven to get the word out. Journalists were finally able to confirm, through on-the-ground reporting, accounts of gross human rights abuses that up until now had only been speculated upon from a distance.
The government has its own narration. It wants to tell the international community that the conflict happened without much casualties on civilians.
አንዲት ከተማ አንድ ሰው አልገደለም መከላከያ የማንም ሀገር ወታደር ቢሆን ከዚህ በልጥ ብቃት ማሳየት አይችልም።
But as we know, war has ugly features, especially destabilizing civilians. Mass atrocities can be committed. This is the ugly face of the conflict.
Or Ethiopian government forces are forming part of the problem and not the solution. They've systemically prevented the addressing of the humanitarian issue by blocking the humanitarian agencies, NGOs from accessing swaths of the Tigray region. So this has exacerbated the hunger issue, and it definitely points to the state wanting to prevent the greater public from learning about the uglier side of the war.
This conflict comes down to a power struggle involving different ethnic groups, Tigrayans, Oromos, and Amharas, and the governments that claim to represent them. Tigray is in northern Ethiopia, bordering Eritrea, and is led by the TPLF, the party that used to control the central government in Addis Ababa. Since 2018, Ethiopia's government has been led by an Oromo, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. A year ago, Abiy put all elections on hold, arguing that sending millions to the polls during a pandemic would put lives at risk. The TPLF defied Abiy. In September, it held a regional election in Tigray, which it says it won. When Abiy's government declared that election illegal and cut off funding to Tigray, TPLF forces attacked a federal military base, and Abiy responded by sending in the troops. Shortly thereafter, most journalists were locked out. When they finally got back in, federal authorities took issue with their coverage. But they didn't go after those journalists. They targeted Ethiopian producers, translators, and fixers, hired by the likes of the Financial Times and Agence France Presse. Among those arrested, the local fixer, who took an AFP photographer to a memorial service.
So you invite the foreign media, and if you arrest their local partners, that is incapacitating them, because most of these journalists are not Amharic or Tigrinya speakers. They don't know where to go and how to go. So they need a local assistance. And we don't yet know why they are arrested. The exact charges against these people are not yet clear.
International media cannot get the full picture without translators, fixers, people who know the landscape. So the international media that is allowed to cover, events from Tigray are left with no support from the local fixers, local translators, but only the government.
It's believed that the majority of the Tigray region remains inaccessible, especially the rural areas where the humanitarian crisis is at its worst.
So what kind of information are they going to come out with?
Those fixers and producers have since been released, but message sent and understood. In the months that news outlets and NGOs were locked out of Tigray, some found workarounds to tell what is a distressing story. Amnesty International had testimony that various villages had been burned down. Lacking investigators on the ground to confirm that, it used eyes in the sky, satellite imagery instead. CNN also had eyewitness accounts from refugees who had made it out. It used animation to illustrate their stories.
They didn't ask any question. They just opened fire.
And the UK's Daily Telegraph got hold of a phone video reportedly shot by an Ethiopian soldier. The footage you are about to see is graphic and disturbing.
The video, which is about 4 minutes long, it shows Ethiopian soldiers walking amongst the bodies of about 40 dead villagers outside of a monastery. You can see noticeable bullet wounds in the back And the evidence points to summary executions, the Ethiopian army committing an atrocity outside of the monastery.
Our digital team was able to geolocate it to a place called Debra Abai in western Tigray. And the soldiers were recording and they specifically talked to one of the survivors. They were even discussing whether to finish him off, to kill him or not. We are trying to get some more witnesses to verify these specifics, but phone communication was done last week and it was impossible to get testimonies about that situation.
The Ethiopian government refuses to call this a war or even a military conflict. It prefers the term rule of law operations. In January, its press secretary accused the international media of sensationalistic reporting and fixating on Prime Minister Abiy over the Nobel Prize he won in 2019 after making peace with Eritrea, his current allies in Tigray. Had we been granted the interview that multiple government officials denied us, we would have asked, what did you expect? The press secretary also said international news outlets were guilty of essentializing and condensing complex issues into a single narrative, that the reporting has been one-sided. The "it takes two to tango" argument.
So the point that the press secretary raised is valid to some extent. I can give you an example on this. A recent coverage by the New York Times reported that, Mr. Abiy, winner of the 2019 Nobel Peace Prize, launched a surprise military offensive in November. This is a big distortion. This was not a surprise military offensive launched by the Prime Minister. The surprise military offensive was launched by the TPLF. It was a dangerous game that they lost. So this kind of coverage does not help anyone.
She argues that it's a single narrative thing. Of course, she meant to say that the Ethiopian government's involvement in Tigray was forced upon it, and that they also insist that it is a law enforcement. But here's the challenge for that. This war did not happen overnight. The crisis deteriorated for every week, every month, every last hour of prior to the 4th of November. There is only one narrative to that, and that's a narrative of a massive failure of managing the political differences in the country that led to the armed struggle between these two forces.
The fighting in Tigray has gone on for months, and in just 1 week, journalists emerged with detailed allegations of ethnic cleansing, unsettling images of grief and suffering, but nothing close to the full picture. History teaches us, however, that war crimes are hard to hide, that no matter how difficult those responsible make it for investigators and journalists to do their job, those stories will be told. They will come in time.
It's been almost 2.5 years now since the Saudi Arabian journalist Jamal Khashoggi was murdered at the Saudi embassy in Istanbul. Now, press freedom advocates are out for justice, and they're going after the crown prince believed to have ordered the killing, Mohammed bin Salman. Johanna Hoos has been following this story. Joe, what can you tell us about this new case against MBS?
Well, this past Monday, the Paris-based media watchdog Reporters Without Borders, which in French is known as Reporters Sans Frontières, or RSF, filed a criminal case against the Crown Prince and 4 other Saudi officials for crimes against humanity for their systematic attacks on journalists, including Khashoggi. Now, this case was actually filed in a German court because RSF's lawyers say that the German legal system is best suited to prosecute international crimes. RSF says that its aim is to hold bin Salman and the other officials accountable for their organizational or executive responsibility in Khashoggi's killing as well as their involvement in developing it. So it details 34 cases of journalists currently behind bars in Saudi Arabia, including a blogger called Raif Bedawi, who has been imprisoned since 2012 for insulting Islam through electronic channels.
Anyway, تريوا زلهم محوات تزقرب زلو كله أنا نجار تم زقرب زلو سبات حدا ناي ميس إنفورميشن نهابلو أنا بقلاو ناي حقهم سكريو ملكات تقولش أنا جرا يكونني أنا بقلاو حسوتي كم جمرات هزمونا هزب تجرا يتسألاتيو هزون تزم سكرو زلو مسكرنات نزباو يعني هرنا تجرا كم جموري ነገር ግን ኩሉ ተዓለም ይርአ ስለዘሎ ኩሉ ይርአ ስለዘሎ ሰለስተ ወርሒ ዝተገበረ ዓበይቲ ሽግራት ኣሎ ንሱታት ከሪአኩም እየ እዚ እቶም መብዛሕትኡ ዝበፅሑ ሓደጋታት ረእይዎ እንታይ ሓደጋታት ናይ መስፍን ኢንጂነሪንግ መኻይን ትሪእዎን ኣለኹም ሽመን ቀይሮም ሓንፂፆም እዮም ናብ ጣይስሙ ዝወስድዎን ዘለዉ ህዝብና ኣብ ሱዳንን ኣብ ተፈላለዩ ቦታታትን ትሪእዎ ኣለኹም እንታይ ዓይነት ሽግር የጋጥሞም ዘሎ እዚ ህዝቢ ትግራይ ኣብ ሱዳን ንብረቱ ከምዚኦም ዝጉሕፍዎ ዘለዉ ናይ ኤርትራውያን ወታደራት ዝኾና እዚ ትሪእዎ ኣለኹም ዶክተር ዝነበረ ኣብ ዓድዋ ዶክተር ዝነበረ ሓሪዶም ኣሲሮም ቀቲሎምዎ ማለት እዩ ህዝብና ፍቆደ ጣሻ እዩ ዝነብር ዘሎ تريوا اللهم زي بسودان سدتين تاتي هساون تقول حزن فقدو قد ما ينزل نبرة زلا فقدو قد ما زي زنبرة نه هوسبيتال سابلايز كله يعني أمو أكاسيلهم زوسد وسيدهم كارتونات دم أكاسيلهم يوم كده نه نفس وقف سبات صوفا هي طرفه يوم حزام خيرهم أو زنبرة صحفات نه تجراي إكزيبيشن ما أخلق أكاسيلهم زنبرة فابريكات كله أكاسيلهم أراويت سراويت ناي إيرترا أب من قدي كميلو 5 خزلو تري والله بس ناي وتدرات إثيوبيا مالتي حزبنا خاوي باساو سولو نفسو كف وتدر ገንዘብ ከም ልቡ ናይ ምስራዕ ሴልፎን ናይ ምስራዕ ዘሎ ኮምፒውተራት ብሙሉ ነቃጽሎም ማለት ከም ትሪኦ ዘሎ ኩሉ ዘሎ ማሽናት ኣብ ትግራይ ዘሎ ብሙሉ ትምህርት ቤታት ሳይንቲፊክ ዝኾኑ ነገራት ኩሎም አቃጽሎም በቃ ትምህርት ቤታት ናይ ሪሰርች ፕሌስ ኮምፒውተራት ብሙሉ ትሪኦ ኣለዎም ከመይ ገይሮም ከም ዘቃጽልዎ ማለት እዩ ከም ዘይሆን ትግራይ ሲ ከም ዘይነበረት ከም ዘይትኾነ መቃጽሎም ጅግና ህዝቢ ትግራይ ዲፌንስ ፎርስ ግን አፍቲ ዝምቾ ካፍቲ ህዝቢ ወፃእ ዘሎ ኣብ ቦታ ገጠራት ከባቢ እንዳኸደ እንዳተመልከተ ታንኮም ይኹን ታይስሞም ይዕንዎም ኣሎ ናይ ዲፕሎማሲ ስራሕትታት ዲያስፖራ ጽቡቕ ምንቅስቃሳት ይገብር ኣሎ ኣብ ዲፕሎማሲ እውን ዓብይ ለውጥ ኢና ነምጽ ዘለና እዚ ክንቅጽለሉ ዝግበአና ነገር ይኸውን ማለት እዩ زي زجبر زل قالسي بدياسبورا بتعمي زمسجن بتعمي زمسجن نجاري تجراوي حزون كم زي مبركة هلا مينو زرقنا زلوا مالتي تجراوي حزون بانديرون دالتفة سئلن دا سأله فقدو ليتي هون كأتري هون نايكاي تعسرت حد من خبره ناي تجراوي ديفينس فورسون تجراوي حزية بقروا جزيت ما بزحتو جزو ذكروا لهم تجارو حدنتهم تجميرهم حرت حوابيرهم أي حضرنا قطفونا بما دنقاصة زورة شيء يطفونا زلوا كايت عصرت حد الزبل حاولتات كله ندفرسو يوم تعدي زفرسوا زلوا زينا حق مخبار أيقونا كنت زفلت مالتي نا زي مثل نيرو نعهدكم كأربالكم تحسوك مالتي